Hey, what's happening, everyone? I'm Tim Eister, and welcome back to Rockport. In this episode, I'm really going to be focusing on trying to get that pesky residential demand to a lower level. You know, despite plopping down a ton of residential skyscrapers in the last episode, that residential demand bar just won't go down at all. So I'm going to double down and just place a ton of residential buildings in this episode. So I'm going to be working on two separate neighborhoods that will feature a lot of medium density residential. So I'm not going to be placing a lot of super tall residential skyscrapers in this episode. Most of what you're going to see is exactly what you're seeing right now. So little duplex buildings, a lot of row houses, that type of thing. And these buildings that you see on your screen right now actually are some of my favorite buildings, favorite vanilla buildings that come in the game. These nice shotgun style row houses here. They're actually some of the original buildings from the base game. And I find that they withstood the test of time. You know, they look as great now as they did when the game first came out. So I'd like to use these buildings a lot in the city. So you're going to be seeing a fair amount of them in this episode. I'm hoping that it doesn't become too repetitive though, but I don't think so. You'll see by the end of it that zoomed out a little ways, it looks awesome. So along with a lot of residential that is going to be plopped down in this episode, I'm going to be building two separate parks as well. One of which will be sort of a city park, kind of similar to the city park that we built a couple of episodes ago, but not exactly. And the second park is going to be much more nature focused. So just lots of trees with some hiking trails. So, you know, without going into too much detail yet, that's what we're going to be working on a little later in this episode. But anyways, let's talk about what's going on right now. So I'm going to be working on two residential districts in this episode. One of which is the one you're seeing me build right now, which is close to the stadium. And, it's going to be kind of a nice neighborhood. A lot of what this neighborhood is inspired by is actually from Montreal. You know, I've lived in Montreal before, and I always go back to that city for any kind of inspiration. I think it's such an interesting city because it has a lot of North American influence with it being located in North America, of course, you know, being surrounded by the US and whatnot. But there's also a lot of French architecture. Of course, Montreal is a French-speaking city. It has hundreds of years of history. It's one of the oldest cities in North America. So there's a lot of colonial French architecture. And, you know, not that there's any French architecture in Rockport. You know, they're total opposite cities. But I feel like Montreal and Auckland have kind of a similar downtown structure where there's not like a whole lot of super tall buildings. The density is kind of similar, I find. So, for this particular build, I've bounced around from those two cities a lot and taken inspiration from both. As far as the parks go, I've looked at Auckland quite a bit, and I've noticed that there's a lot of green spaces in Auckland. You know, you have multiple parks in the downtown core, as do a lot of other cities in the area, such as like Sydney, Australia, and whatnot. So I figured, why not just build two other parks in the downtown area? You know, they're not massive, but they do help kind of set a nice tone for the city. You know, I want Rockport to be a nice city to live in. Of course, it's going to have its rough parts, which I'm eventually going to get into, maybe a little bit in this episode. But overall, the quality of life is pretty high in Rockport. That's the kind of vibe that I'm going for. Furthermore, I'm going to have to name the 4 separate areas that I'm working on in this episode. So I got 2 parks and 2 separate residential areas. So it might get a little complicated to do that down in the comment section. But actually, you know what? It might be a good opportunity for me to select multiple entries. So fire away, guys. Leave some comments down below on what you think I should name all of these districts that I'm working on. So there's this residential area, and then there's the park that's going to be right beside it, which I'm displaying on your screen right now. So I'm going to start working on the park. So a little later in this episode, you'll see I'm going to start to work on the second residential area, and then I'm going to end the episode on the city park. So there's 4 separate areas that I'm working on this episode. So fire away, guys. Leave some comments on what you think I should name all of these 4 areas. And I think this is a good idea because it's going to allow multiple people to have entries into this this little thing. Yeah, so anyway, for this park, this is going to be sort of the more nature-ish park that I was explaining just a second ago. So because it's on a little bit of a mountain here, very rough terrain, it's not really suitable to have any buildings built on here, and it's not suitable for a nice city park. So it functions well as a nature park for any hiking enthusiasts who just want to go for a little stroll. And, you know, this park should offer some nice views as well. With it being on the hill, you can have some nice coastal views. But on top of that, I took advantage of the geography of this park to place down a radio tower right smack dab in the middle. So this is purely for looks, but it could function as a sort of warning beacon for any natural disasters that may come our way. Anyway, I wasn't really thinking of that during this build. It's pretty much all for looks. And those few buildings that I placed down was basically just to deliver power to the antenna as well as the parking lots in the middle here, because apparently parking lots need power, which makes sense. I guess there's lights around the parking lot. So anyway, that's the logical reason why I placed those buildings, but they also look pretty cool. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this park. It's pretty much just going to be a series of trails as well as a couple of buildings like I just placed down, and the rest is just going to be trees. You know, with it being a nature park, that's typically what you would find in that kind of area, so I didn't want to spend too much time placing down tons of detail and that kind of thing, so I just wanted to place down as much nature as I could. So after pretty much completing the nature park, I came to the realization that this park is kind of boring, which is what I intended to, but I felt like it was a little too boring, and I felt like it needed something special. And upon browsing pretty much every menu in the game, thinking, okay, what can I place on the top of this hill, I stumbled upon this biosphere here, and I thought it was a perfect fit for this park. You know, it's a good size, and it kind of fits the theme as well. You know, we can pretend that there's some sort of botanical garden or something within the dome. So I really think this looks cool here. It's kind of a landmark of the city at this point, I find, and I'm glad that it showed up in my menus when it did, because yeah, it just looks awesome on top of this hill. One other little discovery that I made are these trees here, which I forget the name of. They are sort of a default vanilla tree. They're in the default vanilla tree menu, but they have like such a big canopy, and they look like a lot of trees that you can find in New Zealand, which I also don't know the name of, but they just kind of look the part. And I began using them a little bit throughout the city. And they create a little bit more variation too, because they feature like a darker green color. So, you know, it changes up the scenery a little bit, and I like the way they look. Just like in many, many cities across the world, I have a giant highway here that is creating a division or a barrier between the park that you see on the left and the neighborhood that is eventually going to be on the right. And we can't have that. That's not good. So I decided to place down a pedestrian path here just to make the park a bit more accessible. But not only does this bridge look cool, I think it's going to function well as a shortcut for people who may work downtown and prefer to walk or to bike. And it's also just going to make the park a bit more accessible too. So I'm excited to see how many Sims are going to be crossing this bridge every day. So with the nature park being mostly complete, I'm going to head on over closer to downtown, and I'm going to start to work on more the city park, I guess we'll call it. So you can see here it's smack dab right in the middle of downtown, right next to the stadium built by Teddy Radko. Awesome park. I'm super duper happy with how this park fits in the city. If you haven't already, go check out Teddy Radko's channel, by the way. I've had a couple of comments of people wondering where episode number 10 was, and yeah, I've had to inform a couple people saying, hey, go check out Teddy's channel, because you know, he did a guest build, and he's the one who built the stadium in episode 10. But anyways, in episode 13, we're kind of expanding on that park by building a city park right next to it. And this city park is going to be more or less similar to the city park that we built near the water a few episodes ago. But it's going to be a little different in many ways. I will feature a bit of a public sports area that I'm going to build in just a second here. But overall, it's just another public space to come in and relax and just take a break from all the hustle and bustle of the city. As you can see here, this park is not exactly as nature focused as the two other city parks that I built in the last couple of episodes. There's a lot more open areas. There's a lot more like open plazas in this park. So I really wanted to make this park focused on these open plazas, you know, lots of like cobblestone and brick areas and less trees. Just because, you know, it creates a bit of variance. And you can see here that within the park's borders, you can tell that the park's slowly being eroded by urban developers who want to build some nice luxurious condos around the park, you know, because it's a high land value area, right? So we'll find lots of like luxurious apartment buildings in this area. So you can imagine why this area would be quite expensive to live in. If you look closely, you'll also notice that this park, or this area of town, is very close to a metro station. So all the residents who live just around the park can take advantage of, actually there's 2 metro stations within this area, one of which is right by Teddy Radko's stadium, and then another one is actually located just along the border of the park. So it's a super accessible area for people who work downtown or just live in the area. So that in itself would make this area very expensive to live in. All right, so with the city park being complete, I'm gonna head on over a little bit closer to the coast, basically where we just plowed this highway through this neighborhood, and I'm gonna start to develop the actual neighborhood. Now, this area is going to be much more historical and very densely packed, similar to the Old Town district that we built a few episodes ago. But it's going to be a bit more run down, a little bit rougher around the edges. I'm kind of, in my mind, I'm imagining this area being developed mostly in like maybe the 50s and 60s. So a lot of the buildings in this neighborhood are going to be starting to age, starting to get a little old and dilapidated. And it's not going to be a very desirable area as a whole, just because of the highway that runs right through here. You know, nobody really wants to live right next to an elevated highway running right through their backyard, right? So this area is going to be a bit of a cheaper place to live. You know, maybe lots of college students around here, just due to the affordability. But you'll see that I'm going to make an effort to use a lot less nice buildings in this particular area. You know, you can see here I'm making use of these little 2x2 apartments and just kind of laying them down all around the highway. But I think it's a really cool neighborhood, you know. When aiming for realism in city skylines, I think it's important to highlight these sort of rough neighborhoods that may sprawl up in any city, right? It just adds a layer of realism, but it's something that we often skimp out on just because it's a little counterintuitive, right? We want our cities to succeed in the game, you know, so we're gonna make our best effort to apply the best policies to make sure that all of our cities' needs are met. And, you know, it's just fun to see your cities thrive, right? But when you're aiming for realism, it's important to acknowledge that these kind of neighborhoods exist, right? So here I am just placing down some older style buildings, you know, some old brick apartments. and I think it looks really cool. You know, looks a little bit more realistic too. This little area here is actually one of my favorite places in this episode, just because I took advantage of the fact that this area is super dense and super historical for the most part. So I thought it would be cool to cram these buildings just between these overpasses. And it looks really, really cool with a little bit of detailing, maybe adding some trees in between here. It's gonna look awesome by the end of this episode. So with most of this part of the neighborhood being complete, I thought that I would build a little pier under this bridge. It's not really suitable for any buildings and stuff that I was originally going to put here. So I figured that I would just kind of pave the whole lot and make a little pier. I am going to feature a bit of detailing at the end of this episode, you know, just adding some little decals and stuff in some of the areas that we worked on today. But overall, this part is complete. Now I'm going to be moving upstream a little bit, and this neighborhood is actually going to be quite similar to the first neighborhood that I worked on in the very beginning of this episode. So I'm going to be featuring a lot of these little these duplex style buildings, and basically a lot of what you've seen a little earlier in this episode. So this neighborhood's a little bit less run down. I guess it would be as historical, but definitely a bit less run down, a bit less urban too. You know, we're starting to fan out into to some quieter parts of town. Not quite as much hustle and bustle going on over here. You know, we got this nice separated road with some bike lanes. Just a notch more family friendly, I guess. I'm kind of applying some City Skylines 2 logic here, where most families in the game will prefer to settle in the suburbs and a bit farther out from downtown. And just a reminder, guys, so this is the final area that I will be working on this episode. So if you want to leave me some name suggestions of all 4 areas that we built in this episode, so 2 separate residential districts and 2 separate parks. So yeah, if you guys want to leave some suggestions down below, it would be greatly appreciated. All right, guys, here we are approaching the end of this episode. So for the remainder of this episode, I'm going to be focusing on detailing, and I'm really not going to go too crazy here in this episode. Mostly doing the usual shrubbery and trees and whatnot. I will be detailing just a couple of key areas that I worked on this episode, and that will be it. But I encourage you to stay to the very end of this episode, guys, because I will be featuring some nice cinematics of everything we built today, as I normally do. So be sure to check that out. As for the next episode, I'm really not sure what I'm going to be working on. I'm thinking of maybe expanding into some more suburban areas outside of downtown. You guys have left me some nice name suggestions earlier in the series, which I have not forgotten. I have them written down. So I think I might want to feature some of those areas that were suggested. But we'll see. I guess it all depends how I feel when I boot up the game. You know, a lot of these builds are kind of willy-nilly. I'll boot up the game and I'll just feel like working on an area, and it's sometimes totally irrelevant to what I said in the previous episode. But anyways, it's all fun and games in City Skylines. So that's going to be it for me today, guys. I thank you so much for watching. As usual, I encourage you to leave a like, leave some comments down below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next episode. But until then, take care, guys.